Hi, my name is Eric Wilson, aka Milady Vivlon, and I'm in Kelowna, BC, on Lake Okanagan, and enjoying the sunshine. Temperature's cool but pleasant, and I thought the lake was a fitting backdrop for this next video because it has to do with water. You might wonder why. Well, when we're waking up, one of the first things we ask ourselves is, where do I go? You see, all our lives we've been taught that the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses is like this great ark, like the Ark of Noah, and it is the vehicle that we must remain in if we're going to be saved when Armageddon comes. This attitude is so pervasive that if you ask someone, what did Peter say, or how did Peter answer Jesus when Jesus asked him if they wanted to go? This was the circumstance where he had given a discourse telling his listeners that they would have to eat of his flesh and drink of his blood if they wanted to have everlasting life. And many found this offensive and left. And he turned to Peter and the disciples and said, "You don't want to go as well, do you?" And Peter answered, and if you ask this of any Jehovah's Witness, I'll lay money that almost 10 out of 10 will say, Peter said, "Where else will we go, Lord?" But he didn't. Look it up. He said, "To whom will we go? To whom will we go?" Because he recognized that salvation didn't depend on a place or being inside of a group. It depended on a person. Salvation depended on turning toward Jesus. Interesting thought, isn't it? So how does that apply to Jehovah's Witnesses? Well, with the mindset that we must be in an ark-like organization, we might think of ourselves as being in a boat. All the other religions are boats as well. There's a Catholic boat, a Protestant boat, an evangelical boat, a Mormon boat. They're all sailing in the same direction, like being on this lake. There's no waterfall at the other end, but if there were, the image would be they'd all be sailing toward the waterfall. And one day, when Armageddon comes, over they go. But Jehovah's Witnesses are in a different boat. Our organization is sailing in the other direction. We're sailing toward paradise, and everybody on board the boat is going to be saved. But when we wake up, when we realize that Jehovah's Witnesses have false doctrine, just like the other religions, different false doctrine, but still false doctrine. When we realize that Jehovah's Witnesses have been guilty of negligence, criminal negligence, as in the case of the child abuse scandals, and have been found guilty in multiple courts in multiple lands of the same crime of negligence. When we realize that Jehovah's Witnesses have acted hypocritically in telling their flock they must remain neutral, and even disfellowshipping or disassociating those who fail to remain neutral politically, while at the same time affiliating themselves with the United Nations organization for a period of 10 years, no less. When we realize all these things, we realize our boat is just like the others. It's sailing in the same direction. And we think, well, where do I go? We don't think like Peter. We think like trained Jehovah's Witnesses. Where do I go? Well, again, thinking about the water behind me, there's an illustration given by Jesus to tell us exactly where to go. And it's an interesting account because Jesus was not a showy man. He was not given to great displays of showmanship. Matter of fact, when he cured people, when he healed people, when he resurrected the dead, often he told those who were present not to spread the word about it. So for him to make a showy display of power seems unusual, seems uncharacteristic. And yet in Matthew 14:23, that's basically what we find. He says, after sending the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. By now the boat was many hundreds of yards away from land, struggling against the waves because the wind was against them. But in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. When they caught sight of him walking on the sea, the disciples were troubled, saying, "It is an apparition." And they cried out in fear. But once Jesus said to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter answered, "Look, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you over the waters." He said to him, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked over the waters and went toward Jesus. But looking at the windstorm, he became afraid. And when he started to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately stretching out his hand, Jesus caught hold of him and said to him, "You with little faith, why did you give way to doubt?" As showy as this would seem, I mean, why walk on water? He could have gone with them on the boat. No, he wanted to make a very important point. He was telling them, by faith, you can accomplish anything. Do we get the point? Our boat may be sailing in the wrong direction, but we can walk on water. We don't need the boat. For us, many of us, it's hard to understand being able to worship God outside of an arrangement that is highly structured. We feel we need that structure, otherwise we will fail. That's only because we've been trained to think that way. Faith should help us to overcome that. It is easy to see men, and therefore it is easy to follow men. A governing body is highly visible. They speak to us, sometimes often with great persuasion. They can convince us. Jesus, on the other hand, is invisible. His words are written down. We have to study. We have to think about them. We have to see that which cannot be seen. That's what faith is for. It gives us eyes to see that which is invisible. Jesus called Satan the ruler of the world in John 14:30. If Satan can rule the world, even though he is invisible, if he can control this world, do we not think that Jesus can control the Christian congregation? Those wheat-like Christians that are willing to follow him and not men? I have seen this at work. I have seen this at work often. It took a while for me to get rid of the indoctrination, the doubt, the fear that we would need some kind of control, some kind of authoritarian control, that without it there would be chaos in the congregation. I have found quite the opposite. When you get a group of individuals together who love Jesus, who look to him as their leader, who allow the Spirit to come into their lives, into their minds and hearts, who study his word, they control each other. They help each other, they nourish each other, they feed each other, they guard each other, because the Spirit does not work through one man or even a group of men. It works through the entire Christian congregation. That's what the Bible says. You might say, well, what of the faithful and discreet slave? Well, who is the faithful and discreet slave? Jesus posed that as a question. He didn't give us the answer. He said the slave would be proven faithful and discreet upon his return. Well, he hasn't come back yet. So it is the height of hubris to suggest that anyone is the faithful and discreet slave. And how do we know that someone isn't a faithful and discreet slave? Well, the characteristics are there. He did say that you'd know the wicked slave because the wicked slave would abuse the flock. Well, at the annual meeting a few years ago, David Splain used the example of a waiter to talk about the faithful and discreet slave. And it's not a bad example, actually, although it was misapplied in the case of the Organization of Jehovah's Witnesses. But if you go to a restaurant, the waiter brings you food, but the waiter doesn't tell you what food to eat. He doesn't demand that you eat the food he brings you. He doesn't punish you if you fail to eat the food he brings you. And if you criticize the food, he doesn't go out of his way to make your life a living hell. But that is not the way of the faithful and discreet slave, so-called, in the Organization of Jehovah's Witnesses. If you disagree with the food they provide, if you think that it's wrong, if you want to pull out the Bible and prove it's wrong, they punish you. even to the point of cutting you off from all your family, your friends, hurting you economically as a consequence, even to the point of maybe endangering your physical well-being if you're in a situation that requires health care. It's horrific. It's not the way a faithful and discreet slave works. Jesus said the slave would feed. He did not say the slave would govern. He did not appoint anyone as a leader. He said he alone is our leader. So, do not ask, where will I go? Ask, to whom will I turn? Turn to Jesus. Have faith that he can guide you. Seek out others of like mind and associate with them, but always turn to Jesus for guidance. Thank you very much.